They called her the Turtle. They mocked her orthopedic shoes, her grey hair, and the heavy rhythmic thud of her limp that echoed down the hospital corridors. To the arrogant chief resident, Dr. Preston Hayes, Nurse Meredith Sullivan was just an obstacle, a relic of the past. Slowing down his perfect ER, he tried to force her into early retirement. He humiliated her daily. But Dr. Hayes didn't know that the leg he laughed at wasn't injured in a car accident or a fall. It was shattered in the Kurungal Valley while shielding a Navy SEAL from mortar fire. Didn't know he was mocking a legend until the day the commander walked in. The sound was unmistakable. It was the metronome of the West Wing Trauma Unit at Providence General Hospital in Seattle. Meredith Sullivan's voice could be heard coming down the hall. Meredith was 54, though the deep lines etched around her eyes and the permanent set of her jaw made her look older. She wore scrubs that were a size too big, perhaps to hide the rigid brace strapped to her left thigh and orthopedic shoes that looked like black bricks compared to the sleek, colorful sneakers worn by the younger nurses. She was an angel to the patients. Her hands, calloused and scarred, were the steadiest in the hospital. She could find a vein in a dehydrated junkie when the ultrasound machine failed. She could soothe a terrified child with a hummed melody that sounded vaguely gayic. But to the new ambitious staff, specifically Dr. Preston Hayes, she was a liability. While Meredith was moving a bulky cart of saline bags, Dr. Hayes said, "Pick up the pace. Meredith. We're saving lives, not taking a Sunday stroll," without taking his eyes off his iPad. Toward bed 6, Dr. Hayes was 32, a prodigy from Yale with perfect teeth, expensive haircuts, and an ego that barely fit through the double doors. He had just been given the title of chief resident, which he used as leverage. He despised inefficiency, and to him, Meredith Sullivan was the definition of inefficient. "I have the fluids, doctor," Meredith said softly. Her voice was low, raspy, and unirritated. Hayes was the kind of man she was accustomed to. He was one of the green, boisterous, and immortal boys she had seen before. "It took you 4 minutes." Hayes checked his watch, sighing theatrically, following him like ducklings for the 3 interns' amusement. In 2, Nurse Chloe would have arrived. "Meredith, efficiency is what separates discharge from the morgue. Maybe you should consider a transfer to geriatrics or the gift shop somewhere." "Slower." The intern snickered. Chloe, a 23-year-old nurse wearing bright pink scrubs, blushed as she looked down at her feet. Meredith appealed to her. Meredith had saved her from a medication error just last week without reporting her. But no one stood up to Dr. Hayes. Meredith didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply hung the IV bag, spiked it with a fluid motion that was so practiced it was almost invisible, and adjusted the drip rate. She ignored his jab and said, "Doctor, the patient's blood pressure is stabilizing. I have observed that he produces very little. You might want to check for renal strain before you push the contrast." "Die." Hayes bristled. He hated when she was right. She was also always correct. "A nurse who is barely able to walk doesn't need to diagnose me. Just work quietly, Sullivan." He brushed past her, his shoulder checking hers. It wasn't hard enough to knock her over, but with her bad hip, it was enough to make her stumble. She grabbed the edge of the bed rail, her knuckles turning white. A sharp bolt of electricity shot from her left hip down to her ankle, a phantom reminder of metal and fire. Hayes yelled back, "Careful there, Turtle," over his shoulder. Meredith steadied herself and said, "Don't break a hip. The paperwork is a nightmare." She took a deep breath, smelling the familiar sense of antiseptic, blood, and fear. She straightened her back as far as the fused vertebrae would permit, adjusted her scrub top, and resumed her work. Later that evening, in the break room, Meredith sat alone, massaging her thigh. The rain lashed against the Seattle windows. "He's a prick, Mary," someone complained from the doorway. It was Gus, the 60-year-old janitor, pushing a mop bucket, his own gait uneven. Gus was the only one who called her Mary. "He's just young, Gus," Meredith remarked, sipping lukewarm coffee. "He thinks medicine is about being the smartest person in the room." "He thinks medicine is about him," Gus corrected, limping over to sit opposite her. He had the look, that distant thousand-yai stare that Meredith recognized in the mirror every morning. "Why don't you tell him or tell HR that limp? I know a combat injury when I see one." "You didn't get that falling off a bicycle," Meredith smiled, a small, sad curving of her lips. "It doesn't matter where it came from, Gus. It only matters that I can still do the job." "You do the job better than any of them," Gus spat. "I saw you last week with that gunshot victim, the way you packed that wound. That wasn't nursing school stuff. That was field medic stuff." Meredith's eyes hardened slightly. "Gus, all right. All right. I'll keep your secrets." He stood up, his knees cracking. "But one of these days that golden boy is going to push you too far, and I hope I'm there to see you snap him in half." "I don't snap, Gus," Meredith said, staring into her black coffee. "I endure. But endurance has a limit." And at Providence General, the limit was approaching faster than Meredith realized. The hospital board had announced a staff revitalization program aimed at cutting costs and modernizing the workforce. Dr. Hayes had been put in charge of the nursing performance reviews. The following morning, Meredith discovered an envelope in her locker that contained a formal notification, a mandatory physical competency evaluation. She stared at the paper, realizing that it was a trap, since they couldn't fire her due to her age and her impeccable record. Hayes was going to attempt to fire her due to her physical condition. "Game on, doctor," she whispered as she folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. Her hand brushed the small, worn St. Christopher medal she kept there. Evaluation was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Friday, the busiest time in the ER. It was a calculated move. Hayes wanted her exhausted before she even started. The test was humiliating. It took place in the physical therapy gym with Dr. Hayes and the HR director, Mrs. Gable, watching with clipboards. They made her lift 50 lb boxes. They made her perform CPR compressions on a dummy for 10 minutes straight, without stopping. Meredith did it all. She swept, her face turning pale as the pain in her legs screamed like a banshee, but she didn't stop. Her rhythm on the CPR dummy was perfect, 100 beats per minute, hard and fast, staying alive, but in her head, she wasn't in a gym in Seattle. Flashback, October 2009. Korangal Valley, Afghanistan. The dust was choking. It tasted like pulverized stone and copper blood. The noise was deafening, the snap hiss of AK-47 rounds passing inches overhead. The roar of the outgoing heavy machine gun fire. Lieutenant Meredith Sullivan, embedded to Nurse Corps attached to a forward surgical team FCEST, was crouched behind a crumbling mud wall. But she wasn't supposed to be this far forward. The convoy had been ambushed. The lead Humvee was burning. "We need a medic. We have a man down in the open. Viper 2 is down." The radio crackled. The corpsman was Dink. The nearest SEAL operator was pinned down, dragging his captain. Meredith didn't think. She didn't analyze the risk. She saw the blood spray. She ran. She grabbed her medbag and sprinted across the open ground. Bullets kicked up dirt around her boots. She slid into the crater where the 2 SEALs were sheltering. "Who the hell are you?" the captain roared. He was bleeding from the neck, but he was holding pressure on his sergeant's femoral artery. The captain's name tape read, "Mercer." "I'm your best chance, Captain," Meredith yelled over the mortar blasts. "Move your hand." She went to work. Tornet packing. Quick clot. She worked with the precision of a machine. But then the whistle came. Incoming. The mortar didn't hit the crater. It hit the wall beside them. The explosion threw Meredith backward. She felt a sensation like a sledgehammer smashing into her left hip. The world went white, then red, then black. When she woke up, she was being dragged. Captain Mercer was pulling her. He had taken her round to the shoulder, but he was dragging her. Her leg was twisted at an impossible angle. The bone was exposed. "I got you, Doc." Mercer was grunting. "I got you. Don't you die on me. You saved my guy. I'm not leaving you." Back in the gym, Meredith gasped. "Time." Dr. Hayes called out, looking bored. Meredith stopped the compressions. She was panting heavily, sweat dripping from her nose. Her leg was throbbing with such intensity that her vision blurred. "Well," Hayes said, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Technically, you passed the physical requirements, but I noted significant hesitation in your movement during the lift, and you were visibly struggling to catch your breath." "I completed the tasks," Meredith wheezed, standing up straight despite the agony. "Barely," Hayes sneered. "Meredith, look at yourself. You're wrecking your body, and frankly, it's unsightly. Patients want to see vitality. They want to see health. Seeing you drag yourself around, it kills morale." Mrs. Gable from HR looked uncomfortable. "Preston, she passed the test." "We can't. I'm putting her on probation," Hayes interrupted. "One slip-up, one missed vein, one delayed response to a code, and she's out." 4. He moved closer to Meredith, lowering his voice so Mrs. Gable couldn't hear, and said, "I'm going to run you out of here, Sullivan. You're a broken toy. Go home and knit." Meredith looked him in the eye, her eyes a piercing icy blue, the eyes of a woman who had stared down Taliban warlords. "I will go home when my shift is over, Doctor," Meredith said quietly, not a moment before Hayes laughed and left. The next week was terrible. Charting in front of families. He made her redo procedures that were perfectly done. The other nurses began to distance themselves. They were afraid of the splash damage. If you stood next to Meredith, Hayes would target you too. Only Chloe, the young intern, stuck by her, silently helping her lift heavy patients when Hayes wasn't looking. "Why do you stay?" Chloe whispered one night at the nurse's station, watching Meredith rub lidocaine cream on her hip under the desk. "You could get a job at a clinic, a desk job. Why take this abuse?" Meredith looked at the triage. Bored. It was full. Car crashes, overdoses, heart attacks. "Because, Chloe," Meredith said, "when things go wrong, really wrong, you don't want the person with the best hair. You want the person who doesn't panic. And I never panic." "But Hayes is a peacetime doctor," Meredith said. "He's great when the textbooks work. But chaos is coming. It always does." And chaos arrived 3 days later on a rainy Tuesday. It started with a call from the charge nurse. A code black. Mass casualty incident. The intercom blared. Highway 5 pileup. Multiple traumas. Bus rollover. ETA 5 minutes. The ER exploded into action. But then a second call came through on the secure line. The red phone that usually gathered dust at the central desk. Dr. Hayes picked it up. He listened, his face draining of color. He hung up, looking shaken. "Change of plans," Hayes shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "We have a VIP transport coming in hot via helicopter. Divert the trauma cases to Seattle Grace. We are clearing trauma bays 1 and 2. "What?" Meredith stepped forward. "We can't divert a bus rollover. We have the capacity. This comes from the Department of Defense. Sullivan." Hayes. Meredith felt a chill. Classified transport. High-value target. "We are locked down. Security is sweeping the perimeter now." The sound of rotor blades thumped against the roof, shaking the dust from the ceiling tiles. This was not a jagged news chopper, but rather the heavy, rhythmic whump-whump-whump of a military Black Hawk. The ambulance bay's double doors flew open. Normally, paramedics rushed in, but this time, men in black tactical gear with rifles entered first, securing the hallway before the stretcher arrived. It wasn't a soldier on the gurney. A man in a suit, gay-haired, clutching his chest, an oxygen mask over his face. He was surrounded by 4 men who looked like they were carved out of granite. Beards, oak tree arms, eyes that scanned everything. SEALs. Meredith froze. She knew that look. She knew the way they moved. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, adjusting his white coat, putting on his TV doctor face. "I'm Dr. Hayes, chief resident. I'll be taking charge of one of the operators." A giant of a man with a thick red beard, stiff-armed Hayes without breaking stride. "Out of the way. We need a secure room now." "I am the doctor." Hayes spluttered. "He's having a myocardial infarction." The lead operator barked. "We needed a cath lab yesterday." They wheeled the man into Trauma 1. The energy in the room was deadly. These men were armed, scared for their VIP, and running on pure adrenaline. Dr. Hayes followed them in, shaking. He had never treated a target protected by Tier 1 operators. Meredith hobbled to the door of Trauma 1. Hands were shaking as he tried to intubate the thrashing patient. "Sedate him," Hayes yelled. "He's fighting the tube. His BP is tanking." A nurse screamed, 70 over 40. "Push epi," Hayes yelled. "No," Meredith said from the doorway, her voice cutting through the noise. Hayes spun around. "Get the hell out of here, Sullivan." "Look at his neck veins," Meredith said, stepping into the room. Despite the armed guards, they're distended, and his trachea is deviated. It's not just a heart attack. He has a tension pneumothorax, probably from the fall during the seizure. If you sedate him and intubate him with positive pressure before you decompress the chest, you will kill him. Hayes looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at Meredith. He froze. The textbook said heart attack. The symptoms were confusing. He didn't know what to do. The monitor began to wail, a flatline tone. The giant operator with the red beard turned his rifle slightly toward Hayes. "Fix him now." Hayes panicked. He dropped the laryngoscope. Meredith didn't wait. She didn't look for permission. She moved. The room was frozen in a tableau of panic. The monitor screamed its singular. A creature of textbooks and controlled environments, Dr. Hayes stood paralyzed, the laryngoscope dangling from his limp hand like a dead bird. The VIP on the table was turning blue, his chest heaving uselessly against the blockage in his lungs. This was chaos. This was war. And he was failing. Meredith did not walk. Instead, she lurched, throwing her body weight forward, her bad leg dragging heavily, ignoring the spark of agony that shot up her back. The red-bearded SEAL roared, raising his rifle barrel toward her. Him. Meredith didn't even look at the weapon. She looked straight into the operator's eyes. They were wide, frantic, filled with the desperate need to protect his charge. "He has a collapsed lung, Sergeant." Meredith barked. Her voice had changed. The raspy, polite tone of the turtle was gone. This was the voice that had shouted over mortar fire in the Korangal. It was a command voice. "If I don't vent that chest in 10 seconds, his heart stops permanently. Do you want him dead, or do you want to let me work?" The SEAL hesitated. He saw something in. He dropped the barrel an inch after seeing the turn in the grey-haired woman's eyes. The uncommon, distinct change that occurs when a warrior enters the zone. "Do it," he growled. Meredith didn't wait for Hayes. She didn't wait for sterile gloves. She grabbed a 14-gauge angioarth needle from the crash cart. "Hey, move," she yelled, hip-checking the astonished doctor to get out of the way, and tore open the pricey silk shirt, sending buttons flying across the room. She felt the trachea's deviation to the left, The chest's lack of breath sounds on the right. The tension pneumothorax. The air trapped in the... No anesthesia, Hayes gasped, finding his voice. You can't just stab a patient. Pop. She gritted her teeth against the pain as her hips slammed into the side of the gurney as she leaned in for leverage, finding the second intercostal space mid-clavicular line. Meredith drove the needle into the chest. A loud hiss of escaping air filled the room, audible even over the chaos. It sounded like a tire deflating. Immediately the monitor changed. The flatline tones stuttered, then beeped. Beep, beep, the patient gasped, a ragged, deep breath sucking into his starving lungs. His color began to shift from cyanotic blue to pink. The pressure on his heart was released. Oxygen, Meredith ordered. She didn't look at Hayes, she looked at Chloe, the intern. Bag him now. Chloe snapped out of her trance and slapped the mask on the patient's face, squeezing the bag rhythmically. BP is rising, the nurse at the monitor called out, her voice trembling. 90/60, sinus rhythm returning. Meredith secured the needle with tape, her hands moving with a blur of speed that belied her age. She checked the patient's pupils. She checked his pulse. She finally stood up straight, wiping a smudge of blood from her cheek. Her leg was trembling violently now, the adrenaline fading and leaving the raw nerve pain in its wake. She gripped the bed rail to keep from falling. The room was silent. The red-bearded SEAL stared at her. He looked at the needle in the chest. He looked at the stabilizing monitor. Then he looked at the old woman in the orthopedic shoes, who was leaning heavily against the counter. Clear, Meredith whispered. He's stable for transport to the cath lab. Dr. Hayes blinked. The color. Hayes straightened his coat, cleared his throat and said, Good catch, his voice tight. I was just about to order that procedure. You anticipated my command a bit aggressively, Sullivan. But we saved him. He turned to the SEALs, saying, Gentlemen, as I said, I have stabilized the patient. We can move him now. The SEALs ignored Hayes, instead focusing on Meredith. You, the Redbeard said, stepping toward her. Meredith looked up, tired. Yes. Where did you learn to do a needle decompression like that? He asked. His voice was low, suspicious. That wasn't a nursing school stick. That was a field stick, aggressive. Fast. Meredith adjusted her badge. I've been a nurse a long time, sir. You pick things up. Hayes stepped between them. Nurse Sullivan is one of our older staff members. She tends to be a bit rough around the edges. I apologize for her lack of protocol. I'll be writing her up for performing a physician-level procedure without direct authorization. It's a liability issue. The SEAL looked at Hayes with open contempt. Liability? She just saved the senator's life while you were wetting your pants, Doc. Hayes flushed a deep crimson. I am the chief resident. I was assessing the where moving. The SEAL cut him off. He tapped his comms earpiece. Boss, package is stable. We're moving to ICU. Yeah, we had a situation, but it's handled by a local. They wheeled the gurney out. As they passed, the red beard paused next to Meredith. What's your name? Meredith, she replied. Thanks, Meredith. After that, they left, leaving a void in. You think you're a hero? He growled, moving close to her so the others couldn't hear. You humiliated me in front of federal agents, he said, turning slowly to face her in the trauma room that was heavier than lead. His eyes were cold, hard slits. The humiliation was burning him alive, and he needed a target. You endangered a patient with a reckless cowboy procedure. I saved his life, Preston, Meredith said, using his first name for the first time. And you know it. Hayes grinned cruelly and thinly, saying, You practiced medicine without a license, and that's grounds for immediate termination. Get out of my ER, Sullivan. Go home. Don't come back until you hear from the medical board. Meredith stood there, the sounds of the hospital washing over her. She looked at the trauma bay she had worked in for 15 years. "You're making a mistake," she said softly. "The only mistake," Hayes replied, "was not firing you 6 months ago. Get out." Meredith didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply untied her scrub cap, revealing her messy grey hair, and walked to the locker room. Her limp was pronounced now, a heavy, dragging gait that echoed her. Weary. She changed into her street clothes, a wool sweater and loose-fitting jeans, put her St. Christopher medal around her neck, and walked out of the hospital into the Seattle rain. She didn't cry because she was too exhausted to do so, but she did feel a hollow ache in her chest. Life wasn't fair, but she had learned that in the dirt of the Coincidental Valley. She sat on a bench at the bus stop and watched the ambulances scream into the bay, but inside the hospital, the storm was not over. Up on the 4th floor in the critical care unit, the VIP, Senator Arthur Sterling, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was recovering. The entire wing was on lockdown. Men in suits and tactical gear roamed the halls. In the waiting room, a man stood looking out the window. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a Navy service khaki uniform with the rank of Captain 06 on the collar. His chest was heavy with ribbons, the Navy Cross, Silver Star, Purple Heart with 2 stars. He was tall with hair that was graying at the temples. The man in charge of the detail, Captain Elias Mercer, had a scar running through his left eyebrow. Despite the slight stiffness in his right shoulder, he moved with a predatory grace. "Sitrep Miller," said Captain Mercer without turning around. "Cardiologist says the stent is holding, but the lung? That was close. If they hadn't decompressed him in the bay, he'd be dead." "Good work on the ER, Doc," Mercer nodded. "Wasn't the doc, sir?" Miller shifted uneasily. Froze. It was a nurse, an old lady, crippled leg. She stepped up and drove a 14 gauge into his chest like she was punching a ticket. Saved his life. Mercer turned around. "A nurse?" "Yes, sir. Name was Meredith. The doctor. This prick named Hayes. He tried to stop her. Afterward I heard him threatening to fire her. She said she practiced without a license." Mercer's eyes narrowed. Hayes, the chief resident, real piece of work. He was more worried about his ego than the senator's oxygen levels. Mercer rubbed his chin. Something about the story tugged at her memory. A nurse aggressive field medicine. A crippled leg. "You said she had a limp?" Mercer asked. "Yeah, bad one. Left leg drags it. But when the action started, she moved fast. She had the eyes, boss. You know the eyes." Mercer felt a ghost of a sensation in his shoulder. He remembered heat. He remembered dust. He remembered a voice yelling at him to stay awake while he was being dragged through the dirt. "I got you, Captain. I got you." He shook his head. No, it couldn't be. That was 14 years ago. Halfway across the world. "Where is she now?" Mercer asked. "I think she left, sir." The doctor kicked. Mercer adjusted his jacket. "Miller, stay with the senator. I'm going down to the ER. You want a security detail, sir?" "No," Mercer said, his voice dropping an octave. "I just want to have a chat with Dr. Hayes." Down in the ER, Dr. Hayes was feeling triumphant. He had spun the narrative. He was currently standing at the nurse's station, holding court with the interns and the hospital administrator, Mr. Thorne. It was a rogue action, Hayes was explaining, using his most serious voice. Nurse. Mr. Thorne, a nervous man in a cheap suit, nodded frantically. "Of course, Dr. Hayes, if you say she's a danger, she's gone. I'll draft the papers." "Good." Hayes smiled. "It's for the best. We need a fresh start here, young blood. Excuse me." The voice sounded like gravel grinding on concrete. Hayes turned around and found himself staring at Sullivan, who had been mentally declining for months. a chest full of medals. He looked up and up into the steely grey eyes of Captain Mercer. The ER went silent. Everyone knew who the military personnel were, but this man radiated a different kind of authority. "Are you the physician in charge?" Mercer asked. "I am Dr. Preston Hayes, chief resident," Hayes said, puffing out his chest. "How is the senator? I assume my team's stabilization measures were effective." "Your team?" Mercer repeated. He stepped closer. He didn't shout, but his presence filled the room. "My operator tells me you froze. He tells me a nurse saved the—" Hayes chuckled uneasily, saying, "Ah, the fog of war, Captain. Witnesses may be unreliable. I was supervising the process. The nurse, Miss Sullivan, really breached protocol. I've just terminated her for insubordination." Mercer looked at him, asking, "You fired her?" "She was a liability." Hayes shrugged. "Old, slow. She has a permanent injury that makes her unfit for trauma work. To be honest, generosity kept her alive for this long." "What kind of injury?" Mercer asked softly. "Some hip issue. Probably arthritis or a fall. She walks like a turtle." "A hip injury," Mercer said, remaining motionless. "It's embarrassing for the department," said. "Left side?" Hayes looked confused. "Yes. Why?" Mercer reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen and brought up an old, grainy photo. It was a unit picture from 2009. A group of dusty, bearded men standing in front of a jagged mountain range, and in the middle, smiling with dirt on her face and a helmet tucked under her arm, was a younger woman with bright blue eyes. Mercer looked at the photo, then at Hayes. "Describe her," Mercer commanded. "Grey hair, about 5, but 5, raspy voice." "Look, Captain. I don't see." Mercer ignored him and turned to face the group of nurses. He saw Chloe staring at him with wide eyes. "You?" Mercer pointed. "What is her full name?" "Meredith." Chloe squeaked. "Meredith Sullivan." Mercer closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and when he opened them, the room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Where is she?" "She went to the bus stop," Chloe said. "About 20 minutes ago." Mercer turned back to Hayes. "You fired Meredith Sullivan. You called her a liability, but Hayes insisted that she is." His confidence was wavering. "She's just a that," Mercer said, his voice rising, booming across the ER, so that every patient, doctor and janitor stopped to listen, "is the only reason I am standing here today. That is a lieutenant commander in the Navy Nurse Corps, retired, and that leg you mocked, she didn't hurt it falling in a supermarket." Mercer stepped so close to Hayes that the doctor backed into the counter. "She took a piece of shrapnel the size of my fist into her hip while shielding me from a mortar blast. She dragged me 300 wide." Mercer spat the words. "She is a legend in the teams." "And you?" "You fired her because she walks too slow." Hayes stammered. "I didn't know. It's not in her file because she's humble." Mercer growled. "Unlike you." Turning to his men who had just arrived from the elevators, Mercer ordered, "Secure the perimeter. I'm going to get her." The ER fell silent, back at Hayes one last time. "And you, doctor, start praying she forgives you, because if she doesn't, I'm going to make sure the only thing you ever practice is flipping burgers." Mercer turned on his heel and marched towards the exit doors, his own stride long and purposeful. He owed money that had been past due for 14 years. The Seattle rain was relentless. It wasn't a soft drizzle. It was a cold, driving sheet of water that soaked through Meredith's wool coat in seconds. She shivered as she sat on the bus stop's metal bench. The cold seeped into her left hip, making the titanium pins ache with a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She stared at the puddle at her feet. Because she wasn't attractive enough for Dr. Hayes's new emergency room, she ended up shivering on a street corner and being thrown away like a used syringe after 30 years of nursing and saving countless lives. A tear finally escaped, hot and angry, mixing with the rain on her cheek. She touched the St. Christopher medal with her fingers after reaching into her pocket. Maybe he's right, she thought. Perhaps I am merely a shattered remnant, a sleek black. Water splattered onto the sidewalk as an SUV with tinted windows tore down the street. It screeched to a halt right in front of the bus stop, blocking the lane. Meredith stiffened. She gripped her purse, her instincts flaring. The passenger door flew open. A man stepped out into the pouring rain. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't run for cover. He took a deliberate, horrifyingly familiar step as he approached her. It was the captain. The man from the trauma room. Meredith stood up, her leg protesting. "Sir, the hospital is back that way. If you're looking for..." Captain Mercer stopped 3 feet away from her and said, "I'm not looking for the hospital." The rain soaked his ribbons and plastered his dress uniform to his shoulders, but he didn't blink. "I'm looking for Lieutenant Meredith Sullivan, Nurse Corps, United States Navy." Meredith gasped. She hadn't heard that title in 14 years. "That woman doesn't exist anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm just Meredith and I've been fired." "Remember the dust," Mercer said softly. "I was fading out, losing blood fast. I remember the mortar hit. I recall you taking off in reverse. I believed you had passed away. But then you crawled back." Meredith looked away, the memory flashing bright and violent in her mind. "You crawled back to me," Mercer continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Your leg was destroyed. You were screaming every time you moved. But you dragged me. You put your body over mine when the second volley hit. You took the shrapnel meant for my head." He took a step closer. "I spent 3 years in rehab. Meredith, I looked for you. They told me you had been medically discharged. They wouldn't give me your contact info. Classified. Privacy Acts. Dead ends." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and calloused. "I have a wife now. I have 2 daughters. Their names are Sarah and Emily." Mercer's grey eyes were shining with tears that the rain couldn't hide. "They exist because of you. My whole world exists because you refuse to quit." Meredith felt a sob in her throat. She squeezed his hand. "I was just doing my job, Captain." "No." Mercer shook his head. "Dr. Hayes does a job. You serve." "Well," Meredith gently withdrew her hand and wiped her eyes. "I don't serve anywhere anymore. Hayes made sure of that. He said I was a liability," and Mercer's expression hardened. The sadness disappeared, to be replaced by the cold, sharp steel of a warrior. "He called you a cripple?" Mercer asked, his voice low. "He said I was unsightly, that I scared the patients." Mercer straightened his uniform jacket. He turned back to the SUV and signaled the driver to wait. "Meredith," he said. "Get in the car." "What? No, I'm going home." "No, Lieutenant, you are not going home." Mercer opened the back door for her. "We are going back to that hospital. I have a mission to complete, and I never leave a teammate behind." "Captain, please, I can't face him again. He's the chief resident. He has the power." Mercer smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was a wolf's smile. "He has a title," Mercer said. "I have a battalion of SEALs and a United States Senator. Let's see whose power counts for more today." Meredith looked at him. She looked at the open door. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of something she thought she had lost. Pride. She nodded once and climbed into the SUV. The Providence General Emergency Room was tense and nervous due to the military security detail, but Dr. Hayes felt confident because he had told the staff that Meredith had lost her temper and put a patient in danger, and he had bravely intervened to save the day. "It's tragic, really," Hayes said to a group of nurses at the central station. Dementia comes on quickly. We're have to be vigilant. The automatic doors at the ambulance bay slid open with a whoosh. The chatter died instantly. Captain Elias Mercer walked in. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were 4 members of his security detail, fully armed, moving in a diamond formation, and in the center of the formation, walking with her head held high despite her heavy limp, was Meredith Sullivan. She wasn't wearing her scrubs. She was in her street clothes, her wet hair plastered to her forehead. But the way she walked, it wasn't the shuffle of a tired old woman anymore. It was the march of a veteran returning to the line. The entire ER stopped. Doctors froze mid-chart. Patients sat up on their gurneys. Hayes saw them coming. His smile faltered. Captain, Hayes called out, stepping forward, trying to regain control. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Sullivan is no longer an employee here. She is trespassing security. He gestured to the hospital rent-a-cop, a teenager named Kevin, who took one look at the seals and wisely decided to inspect his shoelaces. Mercer didn't stop until he was nose to nose with Hayes. The security detail fanned out, creating a perimeter. Surrounding the nursing station, it was a silent, terrifying display of dominance. Dr. Hayes, Mercer declared, his voice resounding throughout the quiet department. You told me earlier that Nurse Sullivan was fired for incompetence. For being a liability. That is correct, Hayes said, his voice squeaking slightly. Is that so? Mercer asked, turning to face the audience. She is physically unfit. He noticed Mr. Thorne, the hospital administrator, who had come down to investigate the disturbance. Mr. Thorne, is it? Mercer asked. Yes. Thorne stammered. Mercer said, I want you to hear this. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it with a snap. There was a gold medal with a blue ribbon inside, the Navy Cross, which is the second highest military award, and St. Titus for valor, right below the Medal of Honor. The room was filled with a gasp. This, Mercer said, holding the medal up, is the Navy Cross. It is given for exceptional battle bravery. I received this for the operation in the Korangal Valley. He looked over at Meredith. She was trembling slightly, looking at the medal. But I shouldn't have it, Mercer said clearly. By all rights, I ought to be dead in a ditch in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Meredith Sullivan's refusal to let me die is the only reason I returned home, and am here to defend Senator Sterling. He turned his blazing eyes on Hayes. You mocked her limp, Mercer said, his voice dripping with disgust. You called it ugly. Do you know what that limp is, Doctor? It is the cost of my life. For me, she took a bullet. To save mine, she broke her body. I have never seen anything so beautiful as that awful walk. Hayes had a pale complexion. He looked around the room. The nurses were glaring at him. The interns were looking at Meredith with awe. The room was slipping away from him. That is ancient history. Hayes stammered. She broke the rules here, in this hospital. She's slow. When you were staring at a monitor like a deer in headlights, she diagnosed a tension pneumothorax. Mercer let out a roar. I was told everything by my medic. You froze, she acted. She didn't just save me in 2009, Doctor. Today, she saved the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Mercer turned to Meredith. He gave one of his men the box and took her. Step back. Pay attention to the commands. Mercer barked. It was a command reflex. The 4 SEALs in the room snapped to attention, their boots slamming into the linoleum floor with a crack like a gunshot. Even Gus, the janitor, dropped his mop and stood at attention by the vending machines, his back straightening. Mercer stood rigid. He raised his right hand in a sharp, perfect salute. He held it, his eyes locked on Meredith's. Lieutenant Sullivan, Mercer remarked, his voice breaking slightly. Thank you for my life. For my family. We give you a salute. For 10 long seconds, the room was silent. The SEALs held the salute. Then, slowly, Nurse Chloe stepped forward. She was in tears. She didn't know how to salute properly, but she raised her hand to her brow. Then another nurse. Then the paramedics. Meredith stood in the center of the circle, the tears finally flowing freely. She wasn't the invisible turtle anymore. They saw her. Fighting the pain in her spine, she slowly straightened her back. She looked at Mercer. She saluted back, raising her shaking hand. Ready to? Mercer called. They dropped their hands. Mercer turned to Mr. Thorne, the administrator. Sir, Mercer uttered, his voice calm now, but dangerous. Senator Sterling is awake. He has been briefed on the situation. He is displeased to hear that the woman who saved his life has been fired by an arrogant child. Thorne turned white. Displeased? The senator would like to make a donation to this hospital, Mercer said. A new trauma wing. But there is a condition. Anything? Thorne said breathlessly. Anything? Mercer pointed at Hayes. Him. The silence in the emergency room was suffocating. Dr. Preston Hayes stood alone, isolated in the middle of the floor. The circle of staff members, nurses, orderlies, technicians had instinctively backed away from him, leaving him on an island of scrutiny. Mr. Thorne, the hospital administrator, looked at the Navy captain, then at the checkbook potential of a senator, and finally at Dr. Hayes. Thorne was a man of numbers, not morals, and the math was simple. The condition, Captain Mercer continued, his voice steady as granite, is that the new trauma wing will be run by competent leadership. Leadership that understands that medicine is about service, not ego. Which means Dr. Hayes cannot be part of this hospital. Hayes turned purple. You can't be serious. I am the chief resident. I am a Yale graduate. You're going to let a soldier dictate hospital staffing policy? He turned to Thorne, his eyes pleading. Mr. Thorne, tell him. Tell him this is absurd. I bring in the highest billing codes in the department. Thorne adjusted his glasses. He looked at Meredith, standing tall with her Navy cross gleaming in the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked at the staff, who were looking at Meredith with newfound reverence. Actually, Preston, Thorne said coldly, your patient satisfaction scores have been the lowest in the hospital for 6 months, and your staff turnover rate is the highest. Thorne took a deep breath. Captain Mercer, the hospital accepts the senator's generosity, and we accept the condition. Thorne turned to Hayes. Doctor, give me your badge, Hayes. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker to collect your personal effects. You're firing me? Hayes shrieked. Over her? Over the turtle? That's enough. Miller, a big red-bearded SEAL with biceps bigger than Hayes's head, moved forward and crossed his arms. Time to go, Doc. Hayes scanned the room in search of an ally, glancing at the interns. Chloe, he yelled, glancing at her. Tell them, he said. Tell them about your mentorship from me. Chloe, the teenage nurse who only hours before had been afraid of her own shadow, came forward. She looked Hayes dead in the eye. You didn't mentor me, Doctor, she said, her voice shaking but clear. You bullied me. Meredith taught me how to be a nurse. You just taught me what kind of doctor I never want to be. A ripple of applause started. Gus, the janitor, was the first. The paramedics followed by the other nurses. It grew into a thunderous ovation. Hayes gave a sneer. Stripped of his power, he ripped his ID badge off his lapel and threw it on the floor. Fine, he spat. He turned and stormed out, saying, This place is a sinking ship anyway. I'm going to a private practice where they appreciate talent. But in his anger, he didn't watch his feet. He tripped over the mop bucket Gus had left near the vending machine. Hayes went down hard, sprawling onto the wet linoleum with a squeak of expensive loafers. No one rushed to help him. No one moved. He scrambled up, his face burning with a more profound humiliation than he had ever caused. He limped towards the exit. A true limp this time, born of a bruised knee and a shattered ego. As the automatic doors slid shut behind him, the tension in the room broke. This time, the tears actually started to flow. Meredith didn't cheer. She watched him go, a look of quiet sadness on her face. She knew that hate was a heavy burden to carry, and Hayes would have to carry it for a long time. The formidable warrior softened as Captain Mercer approached her, his eyes wrinkling at the corners. "Mission accomplished, Lieutenant," he muttered. "Elias," she called him by his first name, "you didn't have to do that." "I was ready to leave." "I know," Mercer said. "That's why I had to make you stay. The world has enough politicians. We don't have enough heroes." Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, approaching them nervously. "Miss Sullivan." "Meredith. Obviously the termination is rescinded. We would be honored. I would be extremely grateful if you could resume your shift. In fact, we can discuss a raise. A significant one." Meredith looked at Thorne. She looked at the ER that had been her battleground for 15 years. Her hip, the cause of so much suffering and now so much pride, caught her attention. Meredith said, "Mr. Thorne, I will not be going back to my shift." Thorne's face fell. "Oh, I get it. After how you were treated, I won't be returning as a floor nurse," Meredith corrected. She gestured toward the trauma bays. "I'm too slow for the floor now." Hayes was right about one thing. "I am slowed down by my leg." Chloe and the other young interns caught her attention. "But my mind is fast," she said. "I want to run the training program. I'd like to teach these nurses and these residents how to handle trauma. Real trauma, not textbook trauma. I want to teach them what to do when the lights go out and the suction fails." With a wave of relief, Thorne grinned. "Director of Clinical Education, it's yours. Name your salary." Meredith grinned. "I want a new coffee machine in the break room, the good kind. And Gus gets a raise." "Completed," Thorne said. The rain had stopped in Seattle for a rare sunny afternoon. A small crowd gathered outside the newly renovated West Wing of Providence General. A red ribbon was draped over the entrance. Meredith stood at the podium. She wore a crisp navy blue suit. She wasn't hiding her limp anymore. Senator Sterling had given her a sleek black cane with a silver handle, which she rested on. In the front row sat Captain Mercer, his wife, and his 2 teenage daughters. Next to them was Gus, wearing a new suit, and Chloe, who was now the charge nurse of the ER. "They told me," Meredith spoke into the microphone, her raspy voice strong and amplified, "that scars are ugly, that they are signs of damage." She turned to face the throng. "However, I discovered in this hospital and in the Korengal Valley that scars are merely evidence of survival. They are proof that you stood for something." She turned to the new sign above the doors. The Sterling Wing was not mentioned. The Lieutenant Meredith Sullivan Trauma Center was written in bold silver letters at the senator's request. "This isn't for me," Meredith murmured, tears welling up in her eyes. "This is for every nurse who limps home after a 12-hour shift. This is for the ones who hold the hands of the dying when the family can't be there. This is for the invisible ones." She picked up the enormous scissors. "Duty calls," she whispered. Snip. The ribbon fell. The crowd cheered. Somewhere in the back, the turtle's ghost disappeared forever, replaced by the legend she had always been. Captain Mercer approached her as the crowd rushed forward, took her hand, and kissed it. "Are you ready for rounds, Director?" "I'm always ready, Captain," Meredith said with a smile that could light up the darkest trench as she straightened her back and turned to enter a hospital. Thud, step, thud, step. It wasn't the sound of a limp anymore. It was the heartbeat of the hospital. What a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover or a nurse by her walk. Dr. Hayes saw a broken woman, but Captain Mercer saw the warrior who saved his life. It makes you wonder how many heroes are walking past us every day, disguised in plain sight, just waiting for their moment to shine. Meredith's story proves that true strength isn't about how fast you can run. It's about standing your ground when everyone else runs away. Karma didn't just knock on Dr. Hayes' door, it kicked it down with a combat boot. If this story moved you, or if you have a hero in your life who deserves a salute, please hit that like button. It helps us share these important stories with the world. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a moment of justice. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated and proved everyone wrong? I'd love to hear your story. Until next time, stay strong and keep saluting the real heroes.